Welcome to the Longevity Optimization Podcast, where we discuss longevity, optimal health, nutrition, peak performance, cognitive excellence, and so much more. Dr. Wentz, it is such a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kayla.
Absolutely. We are going to be talking about such an important topic today, thyroid health.
My favorite topic.
I know. So before we jump into it, would you tell us just a little bit about your background and what made you so passionate about thyroid health?
Sure. So in full disclosure, I was never really interested in the thyroid gland when I was going through pharmacy school. I just thought the thyroid gland was this boring little organ, and sometimes it got a little bit of slope and people just needed to take thyroid medications. And it wasn't really until I was diagnosed myself with Hashimoto's thyroiditis in 2009 in my 20s after almost 10 years of debilitating symptoms. And at that point, I was already a practicing pharmacist. And at first, when I was diagnosed, I was like, okay, this is exciting. I know what's wrong with me. This explains some of my symptoms. I'm going to start taking thyroid medications and everything will be perfect. Everything will be fine, right? And that's sort of what I learned in school. You take thyroid medications and that's it. That's all you got to do.
Yeah.
And so I was excited to start the thyroid medications, but they didn't really help me that much. So I went from sleeping 11 to 12 hours a night to sleeping 10 hours a night. So that was an improvement. And I went from wearing, 2 jackets in Southern California to just 1 jacket. So
Yeah.
that was an improvement, right? But I still had irritable bowel syndrome. I still had carpal tunnel, acid reflux, hair loss, anxiety, panic attacks, allergies, all kinds of really frustrating symptoms that weren't killing me, but were definitely influencing my quality of life. I was too exhausted to do anything but sit on my couch. And so I was like, okay, I'm taking thyroid medications. Is there anything I can do to make myself feel better besides thyroid medications? And then the other part of it was that I learned that it was an autoimmune condition. So my thyroid didn't just decide to be lazy one day and needed more hormones just because it was lazy. There was an autoimmune attack against my thyroid, and my thyroid had been destroyed. And that's why it wasn't producing enough thyroid hormones. So I thought, well, what in my lifestyle did I do to create autoimmunity in my body? Is there anything I can do to make it go away? Is there anything I can do to make it better? And so this is really how I became a thyroid expert / human guinea pig, was just trying to get myself feeling better. And I started looking into PubMed research and patient forums, trying all kinds of crazy voodoo alternative medicine things and trying to figure out what actually moved the needle and what actually helped me. I didn't know anything about biohacking back then, but it was biohacking. I would track my markers. I would track my thyroid antibodies and my symptoms. And I tried different interventions. I did a whole bunch of experimental tests to see what was off in my body. And I was able to get myself into remission within a few years and eliminate all of my symptoms, which I thought I was an anxious person. I thought I had I just was lazy or brain fogged or just couldn't wake up in the morning. And it just turned out that really wasn't me. That was the disease process, right? And that was the autoimmunity in my body. And it just revealed a brand new, calm, happy, fit person that was hiding underneath all of the illness.
Wow, I love that. But I think something so important is you started to ask questions, right? You, instead of just being okay with being on the thyroid medication, you asked the question, is there anything else I can do? Which is so important. But then you also said, why did this happen? Which I think is so important because we know that today chronic diseases are just rampant, right? And they all take many years to develop. It's not something that happens overnight. But we have to start asking the right questions. And I love that you did that. Can you talk a little bit about the functions of the thyroid, just so we all kind of understand what it does and why it's so important?
So it's this tiny little gland that sits at the base of our neck. And many of us don't realize how important it is. It impacts every single cell in the body. So it helps us grow hair. It helps our brain function. It helps to run our metabolism. So it's the gland. Some people will say, I have the kind of thyroid that makes me fat, right? So if you have an underactive thyroid, you're not going to be able to metabolize properly. It also helps us generate heat. So people that may have trouble with cold intolerance, this is going to be a red flag for thyroid conditions. But really, it's people oftentimes don't realize how many symptoms just having a thyroid out of balance can produce.
Okay, so now we know what the thyroid gland does and its function. What is the difference between hyper and hypothyroidism?
So hypothyroidism is an underactive thyroid. So it's like a slowing down in the body. Typically, people will have symptoms like brain fog, hair loss, fatigue. They might be gaining weight. They might have a slower metabolism. Um, and they might also have fertility issues. With hyperthyroidism, that's an overactive thyroid. You can think about it as sort of speeding up, right? And so you would have palpitations, you might have anxiety, you might have some diarrhea. People oftentimes will have excess weight loss without trying. They'll just be like, oh my gosh, I just lost like 10 pounds. When did this happen? And they start wasting their muscles. Big part of that might be just really severe anxiety. And in some cases, there might be antibodies that cause people's eyes to protrude. So they might have this Graves' eye disease as well that's associated with the autoimmune hyperthyroidism. And, both conditions do have overlapping symptoms. So menstrual cycle problems are going to be common in both of them. Both conditions can cause hair loss and both conditions can cause fertility issues.
And when it comes to diagnosing Hashi specifically, what markers are you looking for?
So I really am a big proponent of using thyroid antibody tests. So these tests look at whether or not your body is producing antibodies to your thyroid gland, meaning that it's setting up your thyroid for destruction. These tests are thyroid peroxidase antibodies, TPO antibodies, and thyroglobulin antibodies, TG antibodies. These tests are going to be elevated sometimes 5, 10, 15 years before we see changes in other thyroid tests, before we see like TSH changes. And oftentimes, unfortunately, doctors don't quite get it right. If somebody suspects they have a thyroid issue, they'll test their TSH. They'll be like, your TSH is normal.
Yeah.
Or it's just maybe a little bit elevated, but we're not going to worry about that now. We'll just test you in a year or two, right? Where those thyroid antibodies, when they're elevated, that is like the best time to really start the lifestyle interventions to get them down so you don't end up with having so much destruction on your thyroid gland that you actually need thyroid hormone medications for life, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what's the threshold over what numbers are, potentially having Hashimoto's?
So it's a little bit controversial. So I would say functional medicine always has these slightly more, I guess, aggressive guidelines. Generally, depending on which lab test you use, some might say over 100 is considered active Hashimoto's. Under 100, I wouldn't really worry about it. But most, I guess, conventional tests will have markers like under 35 will be okay as far as TPO and TG antibodies go. Functional medicine clinicians might say, I don't even like seeing a 5, 6, or a 10 on that test. That still indicates that you have antibodies against your thyroid gland. With from I guess a normal physiology standpoint, 0, 1, or 2 might be normal as part of like just the overall process of the body breaking itself down and fixing itself as part of our natural cycles. So I would say if I see somebody with like a TPO of 10, I would consider that to be positive for Hashimoto's. Under 10, I'm sort of like, we might want to do a few different things.
Yeah, that's great. And that's going to help so many people. It feels like, and maybe it's just the circles I'm in, but it feels like autoimmune conditions are just exploding. Do you know any stats around that? And, I've also done quite a bit of reading, and women are being diagnosed with autoimmune conditions, I think like fourfold men. Please correct me if those numbers are wrong, but what do we think why is that happening?
Such a good question and so much to unpack here. With regard to thyroid autoimmunity, for every man that's diagnosed, there's going to be maybe 3 to 5 women that are going to be diagnosed. Autoimmunity does tend to be more prevalent in women. The rates are increasing with time. So looking at frozen blood samples from 10 to 20 years ago, if we were to test them for various antibodies for various types of autoimmune conditions, the rates then would be lower if we were to test, a similar sample size
Mm.
of individuals. A lot of people will say, like, oh, our diagnostics just have gotten so much better.
Mhm.
And yes, that's true. Like, we are better at recognizing this, but there's a variety of studies that really focuses on those markers over time in frozen blood samples. And yes, the rates are unfortunately increasing with time. With women, I oftentimes think, like, why women, right?
Mhm.
And I think we have this unique gift capability to be very tuned into our environment,
Mm.
where I believe a lot of autoimmune conditions are unfortunately a way that our body adapts to stress or
Mhm.
adapts to current circumstances. From an adaptive physiology standpoint, for example, Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism, it can help us survive something like a famine. It could help us survive something like a war, because when we go through hypothyroidism, if you were a woman that wasn't recognized to have hypothyroidism and just progressed, you would end up feeling very sluggish. You would be pretty much very introverted. You would not be fertile. You would have all this extra weight. Your metabolism would not be working, which in a famine would be very handy because you wouldn't really need to eat that much, right? And so I oftentimes think about, what is it in our modern world that makes our bodies think that we're in a famine, right?
Yeah.
And or why are our bodies perceiving stress, right? And so there are things like processed foods.
Yeah.
If we were cave women, we wouldn't probably eat something that's in a package, right? We'd
Mhm.
be like, that's not food.
Yeah.
And so our bodies sort of get this message that we're in a famine when we're under eating, over exercising, when we are not eating the foods that nourish us, when we're eating inflammatory foods, when we're eating highly processed foods. And of course, there's other factors of modern life that I think lead to stress. I mean, just watching the news, right? You turn on the
Yeah.
news and you get stressed out, or
Yeah.
watching scary movies. Just being a woman, I feel like, speaking to, I think there was let me start this again.
Yeah.
And there was a post going around Instagram lately where it was asking what things men were afraid of, or what men perceived as danger
Mhm.
versus what women perceived as danger. And for men, it was like, okay, like being out in the woods and a bear attacking me. And for women, it was like walking outside alone after dark, right?
Yeah.
And there's
Wow.
just a lot more threats for women in our modern world than there are for men. And then, of course, we can't ignore toxins.
Yeah.
So our food is highly processed. We've got all these chemicals that haven't really been tested.
Yeah.
They're in our foods, our personal care items. Like, women wear so many more personal care items. These are going to be absorbed through our skin, right?
Mhm.
There are so many ingredients that haven't been tested. Triclosan, something that used to be used in antibacterial soaps and toothpaste, this was tied to increasing thyroid antibodies. Then there are birth control pills. Recently, studies have shown that birth control lead to higher rates of thyroid disease.
Oh, wow.
Um, Other things, as far as thyroid conditions go specifically, is public health. Like, our public health officials trying to look out for us, they noticed that iodine deficiency led to hypothyroidism
Mhm.
because we didn't have enough of the building blocks to make thyroid hormones. So they said, let's be wonderful and super helpful and put iodine in the salt supply. That way, nobody will be iodine deficient. Unfortunately, their efforts led to higher rates of Hashimoto's.
Wow.
And so there have been studies done in Eastern Europe where the rates of Hashimoto's have doubled, tripled, sometimes quadrupled
Wow.
within a 10-year span of adding iodine to the salt supply. Nuclear disasters, to higher rates of hypothyroidism. So there's a lot of things that I feel like are present in our environment. Some are very well intentioned.
Yeah.
And some of them are just toxic, right? And outright bad for us. And all of these things can contribute to thyroid autoimmunity.
It's so sad because I feel like you have to be like a full-time researcher to look at the products, what you're putting in your body, on your body, and it's just so unfortunate that every, piece of food in the grocery store for the most part is sprayed with like glyphosate and we have all these added toxins. Same thing, like fragrance. Like I got rid of all my fragrances like a decade ago. And now I only use essential oils and a few like really clean brands. But if you think about it, where are you spraying fragrance? It's like,
Right on your neck. I used to do that all the time.
yeah, exactly. But it's just sad because the information is not necessarily there for everyone. And even if you have the information, it's so much work. It requires a lot of resources to be healthy. And I think sometimes people think I'm so extreme. But I maybe I am, but also like I do a total tox burden a couple times a year, and I have pretty much the lowest toxins we've ever seen. And I'm living in LA, so it makes it even more difficult. But it has to be something that we're conscious of, right? And like working to improve our products. I always say just like start small and start swapping out more toxic products for like cleaner versions. I like the EWG. Do you ever look at that?
I love the EWG
Mhm.
website. They're such a great resource. So
Yeah.
you can find less toxic versions of makeup and hair products. And, honestly, at first it does seem a bit extreme.
Mhm.
But once you find products that you like and you just get into a new routine,
Yeah.
and then you just have your go-to shampoos that work really well for your hair or go-to skincare products, and you can do it over time. It seems, I know when I first talk to people about doing this, it seems overwhelming,
Mhm.
but you just do it, one day at a time. Like you can just say, I'm going to make over my personal care products this week. And next week, maybe I'll get a whole house filter to get some of the fluoride and toxins out of my water. And then we focus on cleaning up air. And there's just, you go through a process and it just becomes routine and it becomes really easy. And I also am a proponent of using supplements and sauna and just sweating therapy to
Mhm.
actually get your body to clear out the toxins, right? Really support your own body's natural detox process.
Yeah, I love that. I do. I do sauna about 5 times a week and, usually like 20 to 25 minutes. But again, it's like I feel like sauna, and if you can't do sauna, you could do at least vigorous exercise to be sweating, right? But our bodies were just not made to withstand the toxic burden that we're experiencing today. It's really something. Even in other countries, like uh, food and drinks are in glass; they're not in plastic. I mean, the studies now showing that microplastics and nanoplastics are in the placenta and in testicles and in every major organ of the body. And I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but then we have this correlation with fertility decrease and autoimmune increase, and it's really kind of just a sad state of affairs. And so I'm so excited that we have people like you just educating women and men about how we can live healthier lives. And yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, it's crazy because BPA has been tied to fertility issues and thyroid issues. And so it's common in so many of our plastic foods. I personally so I do the total tox burden. I
Mhm.
love that test. And I've also done some hair tissue tests.
Yeah.
Extreme, but I actually think it's extreme to be taking 10 to 12 medications.
Yeah.
Like I was in my 20s, right? And I think
Mhm.
it's more extreme to be eating a whole bunch of food that's not food
Yeah.
and just eating real food and not slathering myself with a bunch of chemicals, right?
I could not agree more. And yeah, I think that's a great test because a lot of times too people when we see this in my clinic, many times people, they do not think they're going to have any toxins. They're like, no, I'm living so healthy. Sometimes you can even be near something that is giving you a toxic exposure. You can be, consuming something. So I think if you can, it's a great thing to invest in, is understanding your toxic burden. So I love that test as well.
And another big fan, another big test that I'm also a fan of mycotoxins testing and the organic acid testing.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we think about, okay, we're living clean, we're eating clean, we're doing everything well, but why am I having symptoms? So I've had a few clients over the years where it was like they're eating kale, they're doing green smoothies, they're doing all the things, and they're very intentional about being healthy, but there might be something that's in their homes that's causing toxicity. And so I found mold to be a potential reason for that, when people are like, but I already eat clean, why do I feel so bad, right?
Yeah. I mean, mold, we see, obviously having a functional medicine clinic, we see patients that have tried a lot of the So I have to keep that in mind as well, because we're all different. But mold can really, I've seen it do some, really sad things, and it's hard to catch too. I actually work with a biological home builder, which this may be extreme, but they come in and they help to build your home like in the healthiest way. They look for mold, and there's also tests online that you can get for mold, but I think that's definitely and then a mycotoxin test to see if you're exposed. So I love that. So how do you classify an autoimmune condition? Is it an inflammatory condition, or what is it? What's happening in our body to make it attack organs?
So essentially with autoimmunity, what's happening is that the body stops recognizing a part of itself as itself. So it might treat your thyroid gland as though it was a foreign invader, and it'll launch an immune system response to it, and that's going to result in inflammation. And definitely autoimmune conditions all have an inflammatory component. And I think where I differ, when people think, okay, autoimmunity in your body, and that's leading you to have this autoimmune inflammatory condition. So, for example, a big part of what I've worked with and what I've witnessed in people with Hashimoto's is gut infections. And these infections will cause inflammatory response in your gut. And this may lead to some cross response against the thyroid gland, and various foods can trigger an inflammatory response in the gut, as can infections.
All right. So interesting, because I'm obsessed with gut health. Gut health. I just sent off my GI effects. I do one like twice a year. So talk to me about how viruses or, poor gut health can lead to autoimmune conditions potentially.
There's a lot of research behind the Epstein-Barr virus, and that potentially leads to autoimmune conditions. What I've noticed, it's been an interesting connection with people who have had Epstein-Barr virus and don't quite recover from it, is that there's also some sort of a gut component with it. Most commonly with Hashimoto's, I've seen the protozoal parasite known as Blastocystis hominis, about 33% of cases that I've worked with. And this interesting connection is the protozoa essentially makes your body have a higher demand for lysine, which is required to fight viral infections. And my observations have been that treating the gut infection will oftentimes help the immune system stabilize and take over and just really be able to handle the viral infections. So a lot of times I have seen people like really focusing on the viruses and focusing on the viruses and trying to clear them and struggling with it. And then we'll run a gut test on them. I used to do a lot of the GI map tests, and I've been doing a lot of gut tests as well. And then we'll find there's a protozoa infection, And that'll be I guess, the missing piece where we treat that, and then the immune system just really gets into balance. So it's interesting. There's been some research studies after like I noticed this and I wrote about it in my books and my blog. I noticed there were a few scientists in Europe that started noticing blasto as a correlation for Hashimoto's. It's also a common infection that can cause irritable bowel syndrome. It can cause chronic hives and then potentially even some other skin issues. So that's been fascinating to me, that it's like one little bug that can lead to this. And in some cases, for many people, it's not just one infection. It might be multiple infections that really, really kind of confuse the immune system, for lack of a better word. There might be some cross-reactive proteins on, let's say, H. pylori or Borrelia, the bacteria that causes Lyme. They have parts of them that look similar to the thyroid gland. So the theory is that when the immune system is trying to fight one of these infections, it might also attack anything that looks like it. So it's been really, really fascinating to really focus on the infection component of it too.
Absolutely. How do people get infections in their gut? How do people get parasites and infections and viruses in their gut?
It's so common. Pets, kids can pick them up from sandboxes. So if you go hiking, you can get beaver fever from the water streams when they're, when it's still water. So you can pick up Giardia that way. There was a article maybe 10, 15 years ago about the water supply in LA being contaminated with Giardia. And a lot of us, like, I think in the Western world, we just think like, oh no, this doesn't happen in the US or it doesn't happen in Europe, where it absolutely does. And I have so many test results to prove it.
Yeah. I mean, I 2 years ago, I had a parasite. I mean, I must have just picked it up from eating something at maybe a restaurant or traveling or, but thank goodness that I did a test and I, realized that I had it so I could treat it, because otherwise, it was slowly increasing my calprotectin and leading to inflammation in my GI tract. But that's what's so frustrating too, is outside of the fact that you have to, do so much work to avoid toxins, it's unfortunate that you're not going to get a GI test from your Western medicine doctor. You have to essentially, I guess, go to a private practice of some sort. Some functional medicine practices offer them, but it's hard to get to the root cause. I feel like these types of tests should be part of the standard of care.
Yeah. And, I kind of laugh because we oftentimes deworm our pets, right, on an annual basis, or we give them worm prevention or various types of support, anti-parasitic support, but humans don't get the same treatment.
Yeah. Great point. Great point.
And I personally always recommend people work with a functional medicine practitioner. There are also ways you can self-order many of these tests. So I'm a big proponent of people really owning their own data and knowing what's inside of them. So there are labs like Rupa or Ulta Lab, direct labs that allow patients to self-order their own labs and see what's going on in there. Of course, you might still need to work with a practitioner if you need medications or some kind of a specialized protocol for whatever is going on in there. But it's kind of easy to see, because it's like with the test, it's either you have it or you don't when it comes to parasites. Some people will say, oh, I did a parasite test and it said I had just a few. Oh. So I don't need to worry about it. I'm like, no, that actually means that they found a few in that sample. There's probably like a million of them though.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Geez, I remember when I got my parasite result test back, I, talked with my practitioner at my clinic and I was like, we're going with the big gun. I want something to just wipe it out. And I was literally at the pharmacy by like 9:00 that night, because I was like, I also felt like invaded or something. I'm like, ew, this like these. And you like total toxic testing. Is there anything else that you really love?
So definitely I do some blood work, and 3 nutrients that I always test for in people with Hashimoto's are going to be B12, vitamin D, and ferritin. So B12, a lot of times people might have poor ability to absorb it from their foods. They might have H. pylori or SIBO, which can prevent them from absorbing B12, or low stomach acid. And oftentimes they may not be able to take it orally. So they might need either injections or sublingual drops or sublingual lozenges of that. The vitamin D, getting it in the 60 to 80 range has been helpful for getting people into remission. So a lot of my ladies that are in remission, typically that's the range that we shoot for vitamin D. And then ferritin, this is the iron storage protein. And a lot of people don't realize that this plays a really important role in thyroid health, but it's required for proper utilization of thyroid hormone. So some people might take Synthroid or levothyroxine and they'll say like, oh my goodness, I just don't feel good. I still don't feel like myself. And they'll switch over to a medication like Armour and feel better. And oftentimes this might be the best medication for them. But part of the reason why they don't feel good is their ferritin is so low that their body doesn't properly convert T4 to T3 correctly on its own. And then people oftentimes will say, okay, I feel a little bit better, but my hair is like still a mess. So we want to make sure that the ferritin levels are at least like 80 to 90 for proper thyroid function. And people might need to supplement with either iron supplements, lactoferrin. They might need to work on infections or heavy menses to really balance the iron in their bodies. And I don't recommend just everybody take an iron supplement, or everybody should just try to get more iron into your system, because some people do have genetic variants where they actually hold on to their iron and they might have excessive ferritin levels, and that can be inflammatory too. So there's going to be kind of a Goldilocks range where we want your iron to be, or your ferritin to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned managing heavy menses. Is there a way to improve that?
Absolutely. So definitely a few things to consider is if you have low thyroid, and then getting on thyroid hormone can help your menses. If you're low in iron or ferritin, there's actually this vicious cycle where that will cause you to have heavy menses as well. So correcting that may help correct your menstrual cycles. If you have clots, like blood clots in your menses, something to consider if you have the MTHFR mutation especially would be high dose methylfolate. So sometimes anywhere from like 1 to 5 milligrams is what you might need to really help that, right? And then myo-inositol. So this is something that can be helpful for PCOS, for Hashimoto's, for obsessive compulsive disorder, and it can also help balance menstrual cycles as well. And in some cases, some women might need progesterone, right? So they might have estrogen dominance, or they might have not enough progesterone. And that could be some of the reasons why they have very heavy menses. I know personally, I didn't realize that I had heavy menses, right? So women, we're not supposed to bleed for like 7 days. We're not supposed to bleed through 10 tampons a day.
Yeah. Cheese. And the new research on tampons, by the way.
Oh my gosh. Yes. I'm like, okay, great.
Unbelievable. Truly. I mean, I was talking to a friend and I was like, man, do I need to like launch a tampon brand now? Because that is just horrible. With heavy metals and tampons, we can link it in the show notes, but absolutely horrible. Well, I'm so excited that you just shared that information. So that's not something that I struggle with, but I'm often asked that. So thank you, because you probably just helped so many women.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. So, okay, you were in your early 20s and got diagnosed. What did you do? Like, what were the changes that you made to put your condition into remission?
So what didn't work was like slathering olive oil and coconut oil over my thyroid gland. That was sort of trending at the time. That did not work.
Okay, yeah.
Seaweed didn't work. High-dose iodine made things worse. Spirulina made things worse. What else did I try that didn't work? Just various types of, I guess, alternative medicine things that were recommended just didn't really work for me. And so that's why I ended up writing a book about everything that I did try, because, you know, in alternative medicine, and when you look online, there's like, oh, take Brazil nuts, they're going to cure your thyroid. No, I'm sorry, they don't. Like, if you like Brazil nuts, please eat them, but don't think this is going to be what really like moves the needle for you, right? So the things that I really did is I focused on food sensitivities initially. I was found to have gluten and dairy sensitivity. Getting off of those two foods helped me so much. Within 3 days, I was able to get rid of acid reflux. My bloating was gone. My IBS was gone. Carpal tunnel got better within 2 weeks. And it's very, very common in my experience over the last decade. About 88% of women feel better off gluten.
Yeah.
And about 80% feel better dairy-free when they have Hashimoto. So these were two very important things. I focused on blood sugar balance. I don't know. I just thought that like eating carbs was the way to go. And I thought fat was bad. I don't know if anybody else is like that or maybe just my generation, but eating more protein and fat and limiting my carb intake was a big game changer. So like I said, I thought I was like a very anxious person. It turned out I was just like on a blood sugar roller coaster.
Aw.
And that helped so much with my energy. I really did targeted nutrients. So selenium, 83 micrograms to 200 micrograms per day can help reduce thyroid antibodies by 40 to 50% in about 3 months. So I utilized that. I supported my vitamin D levels. I made sure I supported my ferritin levels. And then I did some gut testing and adrenal testing to see where I needed that support. Part of my big struggle was morning fatigue. And I was found to have really low cortisol all day long. And so I utilized pregnenolone and DHEA and licorice, as well as some adrenal adaptogens to help myself feel human again. High dose thiamine was a really big game changer for my energy and low blood pressure. And then, of course, I had, I guess, a smorgasbord of gut infections. So I had H. pylori and I had blasto, I had some candida. And I did a lot of testing and a lot of guinea pigging to get myself into remission. It took like 2 to 3 years to get there and a lot of trial and error. And then by accident with my clients who like weren't as excited about like, let's do, $3,000 worth of testing. Like that wasn't like their jam. With them, I accidentally came across doing like a 2-week liver reset that got them feeling significantly better.
Oh, great.
Within just that 2-week time period. So that, for myself, I did like a lot of like biohacking and a lot of testing with clients. Once I started just to really understand the patterns, I was like, okay, we need to support your liver. Here's what we can do for 2 weeks. And then we need to support your adrenals. Here's a plan to follow for 4 weeks. And here's some gut support plan for 6 weeks. And that was my second book was the Hashimoto's Protocol, was based on my experience with over 1,000 people, where I was like, okay, mostly everybody's got some kind of a toxic burden, and mostly everybody's got adrenal issues, and mostly everybody's got some kind of a gut imbalance. So, like, let's not spend all this time up front and money to like do all the testing. Let's get a person on this feel better protocol, and then we could do the testing and then wait for the results. Because sometimes I'd have people like, oh my gosh, you gave me this test 6 months ago and I never took the test and I still feel exactly like I did 6 months ago, right?
Yeah, the gut test is the worst, right? Like people do not want to take this. And I totally get it. The first time I took it, it was so difficult, but the information is so good. You just have to get over it.
Yeah, I've had family members that I've given the gut test to, and they'll like call me on FaceTime and they're like, do you want me to poop in this tiny little vial? How do you want me to do that? And I'm like, okay, slow down. This is what you're going to do. But it's very intimidating. And I've had a lot of clients that are like, I could take this to the regular post office. Are they going to smell the poop?
Oh my gosh, yes.
It's so normal to me now, but it can be very intimidating, the urine test and the stool test. And for people that don't like to do blood testing, it can be quite intimidating.
Absolutely. My mother still has a gut test sitting, waiting. Mom, if you're listening to this, please take your gut test.
It can be so helpful. Please take it.
It's going to be a game changer. See? Okay, thank you. Well, I love that. Something that's been kind of going around the internet that I think is concerning is this whole, have you seen anything about cortisol face? And like tons of women are saying that cortisol is the problem of like the root cause of all their problems, right? And maybe it could be, but then just like you said, you had low cortisol. And that's also problematic. I mean, having cortisol is natural and helpful to energy, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Have you seen this trend at all?
Yeah, I've seen some interesting trends when they're like, oh, it wasn't this, it wasn't this, it was genetics, or it was something. And I think people are really trying to figure out what's going on with them, but they just may not have the background or education or knowledge of what's going on and how the body's working. So we need cortisol to live. Like if we didn't have cortisol, we wouldn't be alive. We need just the right amounts of cortisol, right? So excess cortisol can be problematic, and mainstream media is always like, high cortisol, bad, like you need to exercise, you got belly fat, so on and so forth. But in my experience, people with chronic fatigue syndrome, autoimmunity, people with Hashimoto's, they actually have low cortisol. And it's, you want to get it in just the right amount. You want to have a balance, and you need to have it in a circadian pattern. So we need to have more cortisol in the morning to jump out of bed, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Yeah. And that needs to gradually go down throughout the day. And then in the evening, we're supposed to have low cortisol so that we can fall asleep. And so when it's called the cortisol curve, when that's out of balance, we're going to have all kinds of symptoms. Typically, I will say many people might have high cortisol in the initial stages of inflammation. Cortisol, like if you know a little bit about medications, there are medications that are made to be similar to cortisol, like hydrocortisone and all of the steroids, and they're anti-inflammatories. So cortisol acts as a natural anti-inflammatory in our bodies. Whenever we have inflammation, our cortisol is going to go off, right? And so when we have been under inflammation or stress for long enough, our body just stops sort of reacting to it, where the pathways sort of get done and done. Yeah. So the body will be like, yes, you're still inflamed, but I'm just not going to put out any more cortisol. Is going to get depleted with time because of the body's adaptive response. And so I guess, is the root cause cortisol? Not necessarily. The root cause is probably inflammation. Inflammation or stress in your body, and then your body's releasing cortisol to counteract that, to sort of give you a natural anti-inflammatory.
Okay, going back to diet, what are your feelings on meat? So grass-fed, grass-finished meats are okay, or no?
So interestingly, I looked at the studies with, you have Hashimoto's and autoimmunity. There's a little bit of controversy. Some people will say vegan diet. Other people will say carnivore diet. And, where's the truth, right? Somewhere in the middle, oftentimes. In my experience with people with Hashimoto's, most of them do tend to do better with eating meats. So I've had a few reversals of people who were vegan, and they were able to get into remission by adding meat into their routine. And generally grass-fed, wild caught is what I'm recommending. My theory behind this, like some people specifically with red meat, is that it does tend to serve them. It's a rich source of carnitine, and carnitine can be something that gets deficient in people with hypothyroidism and also in Graves' disease. And that can be really helpful for brain function and just really optimizing how a person feels. The other thing is, oftentimes people with Hashimoto's, they have those B12 deficiencies and the ferritin deficiency. And a lot of times it may be challenging to get that from plant-based foods without supplementing. Of course, in some cases I have had people that are very committed, where we'll be like, okay, let's make sure we get some supplements on board, because, if you're a vegan, you definitely are going to need B12. And I tend to be diet agnostic, where I'm like, I don't have like an agenda. I just want people to feel good, right?
Yeah, I agree. I've never really been too dogmatic on either side. I've tried every diet. I've been many years ago, I tried raw veganism. I mean, it did not feel good. Regular veganism, and, to each their own. But for me, it's just real food, I mean, I do a blend of, wild caught fish, and then, grass-fed, grass-finished, like ribeyes, and lots of veggies, organic, just single ingredient foods, and seems to be serving me really well. I think we've tried to make nutrition so complicated and overwhelming, and it's really not. Just don't eat processed foods.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's just like eat real food, right?
Yeah, that's it. I love that. What are your thoughts on supplementation like desiccated thyroid? Is there any science to support that if you're taking a desiccated thyroid, it's going to actually help your thyroid?
Natural desiccated thyroid can be extremely helpful for thyroid health. It was actually the first approach before synthetic thyroid medications were utilized. The controversy around this was that back in the day, the way that the thyroid hormones were standardized was based on the iodine content in the hormones, which didn't necessarily correlate to the levels of like T4 and T3. So companies would produce batches either under medicated or over medicated. So there were some issues with stability. These days, the pharmaceutical companies that make natural desiccated thyroid, they've figured that out. So they're able to like measure the actual amounts of T4 and T3. And so there's not this inner batch variability. So Armour thyroid is one example of natural desiccated thyroid that is a prescription item. And a lot of people do very, very well on that. That tends to be one of the most favorites of patients with hypothyroidism as far as rating, like what do they feel best on. Do I recommend them over the counter or like buying your own? Not necessarily. I just haven't seen, I've seen some people on them that come to me and they've been on them for a long time and they're just still not getting those results. It's kind of like Brazil nuts versus selenium and like just over-the-counter natural desiccated thyroid. The issue with like the supplements is you're not necessarily, because you're a supplement, you can't say how much T4, T3 you have in there because that would make you a drug, if that makes sense. So when I've tried to work with companies around this and try to figure out exactly how much of what they have, they're like, we can't tell you, or we can't even like, because that would put us in the drug category. So I'm just like, just get a doctor that knows how to work really well with it and get a prescription just so that you can be really optimized on it.
I love that. Well, this has been so incredibly helpful, and it's been such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just such a delight to be here with you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and views expressed on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Kayla Barnes, does not accept responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of the information contained herein. Opinions of their guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.